Welcome everyone to the second webinar in the behavioral measurement series. This series is hosted by the Mind Behaviour Research Group at the Center for the Study of African Economies, which is based at the University of Oxford. My name is Lukas Hensel. I'm a postdoc at the research group, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. It's a delight to present our two speakers today. Our first speaker is Professor Adeline Delavande, who is a professor at economics at the University of Technology in Sydney. And she's conducted and published a lot of research on how to measure subjective beliefs and what we can learn from it, and several papers using these beliefs to answer important and interesting research questions. And our second speaker is John Mungai, who's working at Innovations for Poverty Action in Kenya. He is a research coordinator, and he has led large-scale data collection activities, and many of which have included complex beliefs elicitations. So thank you to both of you for joining us today. Before we get to the content, let me introduce the format of today a bit. Adeline and Mungai will present roughly for the first 15 minutes. They've prepared short input slides to kind of get us started. During this time, you may already ask clarification questions using the Q&A function of Zoom. We have disabled all other functions, but we'll have a close look at all questions asked, and we'll try to we'll get you to answer as many as possible. After the first 15 minutes, we'll have an open discussion. I've prepared some questions for the panelists, for speakers, but we would really like you to participate as the participants. This is meant to be very interactive, and during our first session last week, this has worked really well. So please just ask any question that you have, and we'll hopefully get you to ask it to our speakers. As I said, please use the Q&A function, and then when I call on you, we'll unmute you for you to ask your question in person. If that doesn't work, don't worry. If somehow your microphone doesn't work, I'll ask the question for you. Yeah, and then without much further ado, I would hand this over to our first speaker, Adeline Delavande. The floor is yours. Okay. I'll stop sharing so you can share your slides.
Okay. Thank you everyone for joining us today. So I'm going to talk about subjective expectation in development economics. And I want to start with a little bit of motivation and big picture. So, as social scientists, we're often interested in trying to understand decision makings, and a lot of decisions are made under uncertainty. The decision to go to school, the decision to retire, maybe now, the decision to gather with your friends because you might have some risk of contracted coronavirus. So how do we think about this type of decision making under uncertainty? A typical assumption would be that individuals maximize their subjective expected utility. And we can think about this decision in a very simple diagram where individuals would be endowed with subjective expectation about future outcome, and then they have preferences, and those would be combined to lead to a choice. So, if we think about this idea of meeting your friends and COVID risk, someone might have some belief about the risk of contracted coronavirus if he meets his friend, and some preference for seeing his friends, and these two will be combined to make a choice. Typically, the type of data we have are on choices only and not on this fundamental of the decision-making process. And as a result, as researcher, we face a basic identification problems because many combination of expectations and preference would lead to the same observed choice. So if I observe someone who doesn't meet his friends, this could be someone who is very worried, think he has a very high risk perception about contracting COVID, even though you really want to see his friend. Or it could be someone who has a low risk perception, but doesn't really want to see his friends right now. And these two different, expectation and preferences generate the same choice. So how can we deal with this identification problem? One option is to ask directly survey respondents their belief. And then we can combine data on choices and belief to make inference on preferences. And so, the next question is, how can we ask subjective expectation from survey respondents? So there's a very long tradition to ask verbal expectation data in surveys, such as how likely is it that you will contract COVID if you go out right now? Very likely, not very likely. And the major issue with this type of question is the interpretation of answers. They may not be comparable across individual and even within individual for different type of events. And the response option might also be quite coarse. This is leading to another type of expectation, which should be asked in a probabilistic format. So this is appealing because it's a well-defined numerical scale. You can assess the internal consistency of answers. You can compare those with known events frequency. And, you could also use them in structural models. So the next question is, can you ask probabilistic question from survey respondents, and in particular in low-income country for the context of this seminar? And the answer building from survey and research that has been done maybe in the last 15 years in low-income country is that it seems we can do meaningful and obtain meaningful answers from survey respondents, that there is a lot of regularity in the data that shows that people are providing a meaningful answer. We never can go into their head and know whether this is their belief, but these are some of the patterns that we see. People tend to respect basic properties of probabilities. We see that these beliefs vary with observable characteristic in the same way as actual outcome. It varies with past action, and it predicts future behavior or outcome. One thing that is always the case whenever you elicit this data is that there is a lot of heterogeneity in belief. And this underscores the usefulness of having this data instead of making some assumption about them, which typically, under some form of rational expectation would be that people tend to have similar belief. So let me go over briefly about the elicitation method that have been used to ask these probabilities. So the one which is similar to what is done in developed countries is to use a percent chance format. For example, what do you think is the percent chance that you would have a job at the age of 30? This is a question we ask in Pakistan to university students. And so this format can work well for educated respondents, but maybe more challenging if you're in a different setting. A very popular format has been to rely on physical objects such as beans or stone to ask the respondents to essentially express visually their probability and their belief. So this is a sample question from a survey in Malawi where we ask the respondents to pick the number of beans to express the likelihood that they will die within a 5-year period beginning today, and the respondents had 10 beans in front of him to answer the question. This can be, operationalized visually on touchscreen device. This is an example with a slider. And another option that has been used is what I would call this frequented quiz approach, in which instead of asking, the respondent the probability that something will happen, is to ask him to consider, 20 people like himself or herself, and then ask what the proportion of people would experience the event. This is taken from Demel et al. And the respondents are asked to think about 20 business just like yours. The owner have the same age, education, experience, skill level, commitment, a similar location. So the key here is to try to really think about someone like the respondent. I'll just point out to something to consider when you want to use that format is that when you ask someone what will happen to you versus someone like you, you may still get some discrepancy in the answer. And this is what we see in a survey in India, where we ask respondents, what's the chance you would die within 1 year? And what's the chance someone like you would die within 1 year? This is plotting the difference in answers. We see that 38% of the respondents provide the same answer, but that there is a discrepancy for the remaining of the respondents. So it depends on what you're after, and you should be aware of these potential differences. Let me just highlight quickly a few patterns in the data. I talked about basic properties of probabilities, and something I typically do when I ask this question is asking about nested events. So this is taken from the survey in Malawi. We ask respondents, what's the probability you would go to the market within 2 days? What's the probability you would go within 2 weeks? And so we expect a smaller answer for the shorter time horizon event. And we see that 99% of the respondents provide answers coherent with probability theory. So this is very reassuring. Another of these typical pattern is that the expectation vary with characteristic in the same way as actual outcome. This is showing some box plots of the distribution of belief, again from Malawi. And when we ask respondents, what is the likelihood you would have to rely on family members for financial transfer in the next 12 months? And if I take, for example, this part here, we see that for respondents who have less land, they expect this likelihood to be quite higher than those who own more land and are more protected. So we see this pattern by socioeconomic status in the same way we see them in the data if we look at transfer data. We also find that this belief predict future outcome. This is showing the percentage of respondents who have died when we follow respondents over time according to their belief about surviving in the next 5 years. So we asked this question in 2010 to some respondents, and we come back 7 years later. And we see that among respondents who expected a 0% chance of surviving, a larger proportion of respondents has died compared to those who reported a 100% chance of surviving. And you kind of see this monotonic decrease according to their answer. And one thing I just want to plot to highlight what I said, that there is always heterogeneity in belief when you ask this question. This is again taken from Malawi. We ask respondents the probability they're infected with HIV in this graph here, and in this one, the probability of surviving in the next 10 years. And you see that there is, a lot of variation in this belief data. So let me just wrap up about thinking about how we can use this belief to make inference on decision making. One option, if you're interested, in the belief per se or in estimating preference parameter, is to use them in discrete choice model and elicit belief about outcomes conditional on the choices. So, for example, you could ask respondents, what's the probability you would find a job if you go to university? What's the probability you would find a job if you don't go to university? And you would use them to try to understand the decision to go to university. Another option would be to use them to understand the mechanism of some intervention you've rolled out. So I may not go into all the detail now. If it comes later, I'll go into this. But we did an intervention in Malawi, and we had some hypotheses about how this would change behavior and the mechanism through which it would change behavior. And we did see the change in behavior, but the belief allowed us actually to understand much better why there was a behavioral change. And this was, against our prior when we designed the intervention. And I'll stop here for now.
Thank you very much, Adeline. That's already very interesting, and I already see the first questions coming in, which is great. I'll defer these questions to after Mungai's presentation, and then we can start the whole discussion. So Mungai, the floor is yours. If you could please share your screen. Perfect. Thank you.
Thanks, Lukas, and thanks everyone who was ready to join in today's session. I will take us through a listing subjective expectation from an implementer perspective. So you realize that much of what I'm going to discuss will be from a less academic perspective, but more about some of the things that you're likely to encounter in a real field setup. When listing subjective expectations are from your respondents, so one thing that you always want to ensure is that your respondents are able to understand the basic concept of probability. So researchers in the developing world and those that I have worked with in this field, what they've done is they implemented the use of visual aids to be able to allow the respondent to be able to express a probability. So
Mungai, very sorry to interrupt you. Your sound quality is not great. Would you mind speaking more directly into the microphone if that's possible? The like volume goes up and down a lot.
Sorry about that. Yeah, so
no problem.
With the research, yeah, from the researchers in developing one and those that I've worked with, so what they've done to enable the response to be able to express or even conceptualize the probability. So what they do is they use visual aids. So basically what this does is respondents are issued with a fixed number of physical objects such as beans, marbles, or any other alternative. So which they then allocate to a given support in order to express probability. When selecting visual aid and the support that you're using, there are a number of practical considerations that you'll want to take into account. You'll want to look into the literacy levels of your respondents. You'll also want to take into account the practical, some of the practical issues that you'll encounter, for instance, the number of visual aids that you'll be providing to your respondent, the nature and type of support. For instance, if you'll be asking this, you'll be eliciting the support directly, or you'll have this predetermined. Additionally, you'll also want to look into the cultural sensitivity. By this, you just want to make sure that some of the visual aids that you're using are culturally acceptable to the respondents. You also want to ensure that the language you're using is not so, the language you're using to convey this concept of probability is not so abstract that it makes it difficult for the respondent to understand. So you just want to ensure that you invest a little bit more time during the translation and back translation of the question, or even spend some time piloting just to make sure that these questionnaires actually capture the concept correctly. The use of practice questions and understanding this extreme concept of probability is very essential, and it cannot be emphasized enough. So what we found very useful is using multiple practice sessions. With this, also we found it very useful on the ground when you are actually asking about events or even outcomes that the respondents can relate with. So what we found to do is like you have to be more innovative in this. For instance, if you, instead of asking about some of the conventional things about like the market day, for instance, about whether it's going to rain or not, it will work well if you ask respondents, for instance, about something they can associate with. For instance, something about like a staple meal, the probability of consuming a staple meal, or something of the sort. There are some common challenges that you may encounter in a field setup. For instance, your respondents may ignore the basic law of probabilities. You could encounter issues of focal responses. This happens when the respondents frequent 0, 50, and 100%. So this may happen in some cases where it's actually the reality, but in some cases it may indicate a lack of understanding from the respondent's end. There could be cases where the respondents just heap at intervals, heap the visual at intervals. So this may indicate a couple of issues. It may indicate that your respondents could be actually struggling with understanding the concept. On the other hand, it may also indicate, especially if you had provided predetermined support, it may indicate that your support is not, the ranges of your support are not fine enough to accommodate those ranges from the respondent. But model beliefs also not so common, but you may encounter this. This happens when these respondents put a probability massive in a non-contiguous intervals of your support. You may also encounter issues of unusable answers. This happens when, for instance, the respondent fails to allocate all the visual aids that issued, such that the probability fails to add up to 1. On the other hand, it may also happen when the respondent just allocates all the visual aids in the support in just one interval of the support. We've also encountered in active setup, we've encountered challenges with respondents failing to understand this whole concept of probability. So, and sometimes it actually takes long to explain this whole concept. So during the trainings, you'll want to figure out and discuss with the enumerators and have it in the SOPs to understand like how much time you really want to invest on this and when you draw the line. For the large surveys, it's also helped to predetermine in advance where you want to locate the beliefs module. So one thing that worked for us is we used it. We used the location. We located the beliefs module somewhere midway in the survey, where it provided like a nice break for the respondents from the usual, the tedious and monotonous long surveys. To have some of these challenges that we've experienced on the ground, so some of measures that we put in place include like performing real-time backend checks, basically just to check general check and confirm on compliance with some of these probability laws. So thanks to computer-assisted interviewing, so you can be able to do some basic checks on the backend. For instance, just check on additivity, violations, and just checking that the general distribution from these respondents actually makes sense. Again, you'll also want to ensure that you invest enough time in the questionnaire translation and back translation. And this, coupled with the pilots, really works well to ensure that the concept that you're trying to convey for the respondents, they are able to understand it, and it's not so abstract that they end up either not getting the concept of just ending up to answering the question just to for the methods that you use, you'll also want to contextualize. Again, this is where the piloting comes in play. So you'll want to spend time to make sure the methods, especially even in the practice session, just asking the things that the respondent easily relates to. The quality of your enumerators is very essential, as it affects the quality of the responses that you elicit from this respondent. So what we've been doing on the in the field setup is always ensuring that we recruit respondents who have at least some basic mathematics or probability background, as this helps in when they're trying to explain these concepts to the field setup. So for now, I will leave it at that for now, and perhaps we can come back to this when the questions come up. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Mungai. That was already very interesting. You can stop sharing your screen now. And before we go to the questions, and I think we already have 6 of them, I'd like all of us to take a quick poll on Zoom, just to for us or for you to better understand who's actually participating here. You should actually see a poll right now where you can indicate where you're based. Just kind of out of interest. I see. Yeah, you're already really good at responding. Yeah, so I think I'll end the poll now, and then I think you should you should see the results now, if I'm not mistaken. That is, we have 34% of you, of the attendants, are based in Africa. Another 23% are based in Asia, and today we have 41% based in Europe. So a pretty good mix. Thank you all for attending. Yeah, great. Now let me get to, actually, I think I'll go to your questions right away, given that this has lasted for a bit longer and we already have some really good questions. I would start by a question by Elise Escande. I'm not quite sure about the pronunciation. Could we please unmute her?
Hi.
Elise,
yes, thank you for taking my question. Thank you for taking my question. Yes, I was just wondering, because I know I'm more from a psychology background, and I know that there's a lot of overlapping language sometimes on similar concepts. So I'm just wondering how beliefs are defined in economic sense of it, and also expectation, and if we could maybe just define those terms. Thank you.
Adeline,
Yes, I can take that.
So,
yeah, so I think I've used beliefs and expectation to really, represent the same thing. And I think in when we talk about expectation, it's the probability that something will happen. I think that's the mathematical definition and how we would relate it to probabilities.
Thank you. And in terms of beliefs?
So I think it's what I was saying. We tend to use them for the similar concept. So I use belief and expectation. Maybe it's an abuse of notation, but to denote the same things.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elise. Next question is by Wantana Ross. Could we please unmute him? Wantana is research fellow and director of the Center for Development Economics and Trade at CDRI in Cambodia.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay,
very well.
Thank you. Maybe I link the last question to the first one. So I have two questions. Number one is probably the choice option that we usually put. Can you give a bit of advice on what should be the scale, the choice options that can actually produce the most reliable result when it comes to belief, whether it's 3 or 5 or 7 or 10. Secondly, I'm given the context of COVID-19, I'm designing a small-scale research to try to understand the impact of COVID-19 on micro, small, and medium enterprise in Cambodia. And one of the questions that I'm looking at, or a series of questions, is basically their investments, future investment post-COVID-19. So I think it's also involved their expectation too. So under that context, can you give a bit of practical advice on, the questions that I can use in order to elicit their future expectations in that sense? Thank you.
So I would maybe pass the first part of the question on to Mungai. So when I think this was about when we ask beliefs in Likert type questions where we have multiple answer options. Do you have any experience with how many options there should be?
I must admit that I'm not an expert in this field, so this one I'll be sharing it from more about what I've had in the experience in the ground. So usually one challenge we've had with, especially when you're talking about those point estimates, just define them. So one thing that we found then is that it's actually at times you find it very challenging to basically compare the responses that you get from your respondents. So you will always want to ensure that you include something that is more sort of broad enough to capture the concept, but again, does not limit and sort of cause some ambiguity for the respondents when they're selecting the choices.
Okay, thank you. And the second part of the question was about interpretation of heterogeneity in beliefs, especially in the context of COVID, if I summarize that correctly. Adeline, do you have an answer or like, yeah?
So, I mean, so I'm not sure I understood the question in the same way. So I thought it was a bit about when you want to think about future investment and how you would phrase this type of questions. So I think it depends a little bit about what you are after. And it relates maybe to the first question as well. So if you could be interested in how much they're going to invest in the future, and you could ask what we call, point estimate for this expectation, which is simply ask them, how much are you going to invest? If you're interested in the variation around this investment, then you would, maybe this is what you were saying, Lukas, then you might want to offer some intervals to the respondents and give them, again, physical objects for them to allocate, the chances that their investment will fall into each of these intervals. It depends a little bit, how you design the intervals could depend on preliminary questions that you've asked the respondents. And so those intervals could be individual specific, which allows you to make sure you capture the relevant part of their distribution of belief. This may sometimes be challenging in the field if the interviewer have to fill in this individual specific threshold themselves. So another option, if you have a good notion of, what type of investment value you're anticipating, then you could have thresholds which are designed in advance and are the same for everyone. In my experience, when we've done this type of elicitation of a whole distribution of a continuous outcome, we've used 10 or 20 physical objects, and both. This was in India, and both number of objects were working well. But I think it's really context dependent. So like Mungai was saying, piloting is essential.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I agree that in my experience as well, piloting is absolutely crucial. Next, I'd like to call on sorry, I'm just Dr. Elizabeth Nansiri, who's currently based at the World Bank as a visiting scholar.
Hi, can you hear me? Thank you.
Yes.
So mine is a quick one. It's to do with the discrepancy that you get when you're asking the individual a question that is focused on him or her vis-a-vis when it is focused on somebody else. And I was thinking about the questions the example questions that you've given us, where the framing is kind of negative. We're asking somebody, for instance, what's the probability that you're likely to die? Would that change if the person was asked, for instance, probability that he would survive? And where the contra questioning would be the probability that the other person is likely to survive. In other words, you're changing the framing to being positive than negative. I'm thinking that a person is likely to be more optimistic when it is more of a positive framing than when it's a negative framing. So how does that work out in terms of the discrepancies that you get? Or have you thought about that? Thank you.
So actually in the example I showed, this is one of the rare examples where we also randomize the wording, whether it's mortality or survival, and it does make a difference. We see, across respondents who are randomized into one format or another in terms of their answer. There's a little bit of a difference, but in both cases, we still see this type of discrepancies between what happened to you and what happened to people like you. So framing is important when you elicit belief, like when you elicit any type of questions. But I don't think this discrepancy can be explained, reduced by the framing. I think, trying to make, if you're really after about, trying to pick up the same concept with this question of people like you, I think it helps the respondents if you put a lot of qualification about how similar the person like you is. And maybe that helps to reduce the difference.
Thank you. Next up is Ola Bode Olofin. I'm sorry if I didn't pronounce it correctly. Could we unmute him, her?
Hello.
Hi. Hello. Yeah. Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, please. Thank you very much for the opportunity. The speaker talked about belief and expectation. I think belief is a bit more strong word. Is something that we are a little bit certain of. If you say, do I believe in this? If it is certain, I know if I give you right answer or positive answer. But when you talk about expectation, it's more of probability. It could happen, it may not happen. So I think the speaker should look at that when framing the question. When you talk about expectation and belief, and you frame your question the same way, you are not likely to get a robot answer. That is why I said maybe if she could shed some light on when there is variability in the responses of the respondents to the questions on expectation and belief. So although she has made it clear at the beginning that she meant the same while she was talking about expectation and belief, but I just want to let us know that the two words are a bit not the same. Thank you.
Okay,
Hello?
Thank you. Yeah, we heard you. Thank you. So trying to summarize that, there was like the question, to what extent are beliefs and expectations not quite the same? And then from your written question, the question was kind of about how can you interpret like large variation in beliefs? What are potential reasons for this heterogeneity, maybe, that we've seen in some of the slides already? Yes. Maybe the latter one, Mungai, do you want to answer that? Like as to like why you think there might be a lot of variation in these beliefs measures?
From the field setup, I think from the experience we had, so what happens, lots of variation happens when the respondents are, as a result of respondents not understanding the question. So this goes back to the issue that I addressed earlier when I was talking about making sure that the way you convey this concept and the way you ask your question are not so abstract that the respondent is not able to understand. So the other thing I can say is that it also goes when the respondent maybe I would say they fail. You failed, for instance, to pilot these questionnaires or rather like contextualize them. So the way the meanings are conveyed could be different from the way they're understanding. The other issue that is also pretty common is the way that your field staff are asking these questions. So these are all some of the issues that cause discrepancies, and you want to look into those.
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, I'm not sure if we want to go into more detail about the difference between beliefs and expectations. Maybe in the interest of time, let's move on. Before I come to the next audience question, I would actually like to ask one question myself, and that's something that we haven't talked about so far, but from a practical perspective, has always been a concern for myself, and that's incentives when eliciting beliefs. I was wondering if either of you have kind of an opinion about whether incentives are useful and what situations they are useful. They're generally quite costly to a research budget. So I was wondering if you think that it makes sense using them at all, or whether unincentivized questions are okay.
Shall I take it?
Sure.
So I think there are many expectations we elicit that actually cannot practically be incentivized because they're just asking about events over which you're not going to be able to verify the answer, right? So, think again about this example where you want to try to explain decision making. You might ask counterfactual scenarios, what happened if you go to university, what happened if you don't? And, if you are very forward looking, you might ask about, again, what's the chance you will have a job when you're age 30, which if you ask that to 16 years old, you can't really incentivize. I think this is acceptable in the field. The regularity in the type of answer we get, is very reassuring. And I think people are quite comfortable with not incentivizing them. You could incentivize things that are more, in games or that have a clear, that are more directly, that have a correct answer if you want, and against which you could incentivize. There's some, in different contexts, there's some evidence that actually using this proper scoring rule might lead to biased belief because the stake, might change what you're actually after. So it's not even clear that this will get you unbiased belief with risk-averse respondents.
Thank you. That's quite useful and reassuring from a practical perspective that there's no need to pour too much incentives into that and too much resources into that. Next question, I'd like to call Dr. Hensel Nwokolo, who teaches finance at Lagos Business School.
All right, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, so my question basically is, if you summarize it, how can you use probabilistic expectations to help managers in developing countries to inform their decision making? So given that there's a lot of uncertainty in developing countries, like for instance, in Nigeria and Africa, political uncertainty or economic uncertainty. So how can this tool or this design help them to make decisions? And if so, how?
Thank you.
If you can give an example or two, that would be nice.
So I'm not sure. So the question was whether, how these methods can potentially be helpful to businesses in Africa.
To managers of businesses in Africa to make decisions, because the idea was to use this method to help them make decisions under uncertainty.
Yep, I'll pass this to our speakers. I don't know if you have any.
I mean, input? I cannot answer about businesses in particular, but I think in the same way we use this, visual object to convey risk, to ask the subjective belief or the subjective expectation, I should say. We can also use this to communicate risk to individuals. So I have not done this with businesses, but I've done some risk communication with respondents in rural Malawi, where we wanted to give information about mortality risk to respondents, because people tend to be very pessimistic about their survival. And so we had, we didn't have really physical object, but we had something very visual where we were showing, these are 10 people who are alive today. If you come in 10 years, we had a shaded red showing the number of them who would be dead, and another color for those who would be alive. And similarly, what happened to them in 10 years. And we see that this type of information led to an upward revision of beliefs about mortality. So people became more optimistic about their survival based on this information. So I think it's feasible to convey, if you want to convey some risk that people could be facing, to use this physical object or, this visual representation of the risk in order to help businesses understand their environment better.
Thank you. I hope that answered the questions to some extent. Before I go to the next question, let me briefly say we already have so many questions that we are unlikely to get through all of them on this session. We'll try to follow up with all questions asked and provide answers by emails as fast as possible. So if you are not called on today, don't worry, we'll hopefully, you'll still get the response to your answer. So next, I would like to call Farah Said to ask her questions. Her question, probably.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And thanks to both presenters. I think this was great. I just wanted to know about something about the subjective evaluation of events. So where I'm from, a lot of people sometimes don't answer questions about how likely a particular event is, saying that, you know, this is up to God or it's up to fate. And so we don't know, we have no way of answering. Is there anything we can do in the wording of a particular question or the way we ask it to, I mean, obviously some of this might happen, but just to avoid this happening too often, are there things we need to watch out for? Thank you.
Mungai, maybe you want to take the question?
I'm not sure about this one, but this is also something we've encountered in the field. We've even had cases where the respondent fails to hold or even touch the visual aid. So I'd like to pass this to Adeline and just perhaps to shed more light on this.
I mean, I think this is one of the contexts where you might want to refer for people like you rather than what will happen to you. So, you know, it has the disadvantage that people may make some assumption about the characteristic of these people like you, but I think it reduces, you know, non-response rate or other type of questions. So when we've done it for survival, expectation you versus people like you, we typically have a little bit of a higher response rate when it's framed for people like you than for you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Farah. By the way, Farah was a speaker at last week's event. So great to see that you're also attending this week. So next, I'd like to call on Chuni Singh, PhD candidate at the Paris School of Economics.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
So thank you so much for the presentation. So I was particularly interested when Adeline mentioned that you could use belief to sort of understand the mechanism of an intervention. But I was wondering, often it is the case that when you elicit pre-intervention belief, it might sort of spill over to the intervention. So how do we separate that effect of eliciting belief from what the intervention is actually going to do?
So I'm not sure I have a good answer to that. It's a valid point. I mean, you know, if you have a lot of money, you could have an extra arm of your intervention where you don't elicit the belief to see whether that would have a spillover effect, but that's unlikely the case. I think it depends a little bit on the time frame of your intervention. So, I mean, we know that asking survey question, whether it's belief or, you know, savings, influence actual behavior in real life. So I don't think this is particular to belief. You know, if you ask a lot of questions about savings and then implement a microcredit program, you might have similar concerns. So I don't think, you know, a longer timeline would maybe avoid having large spillover from the question, but I don't think I have a very good answer to that, and that's maybe a legitimate concern in some context.
Thank you. We are in our last 6 minutes, so I'll call for, I think, 2 more questions. First, I'd like to give Dr. Chiara Binelli the chance to ask a question. She's an associate professor at the University of Milano Bicocca. I hope I pronounced that right.
Hello, so thank you for the opportunity to ask a question. Thank you for both presenters. My question is to Adeline. I was wondering if there is a consistent way to ask how certain the respondents are about the probabilities that they actually deliver in the survey. So this idea of the ambiguity, meaning the probability concept, you know, I can give you an accurate number, but then I may not be sure, or, you know, I may have my own ideas on how sure I was or I am about the answer that I've just been given to you. So is it possible to include this in the survey, and how could we use this information? Basically, how certain or uncertain I am about the probabilities that I expressed. Thank you.
I think anything is possible. The question is how lengthy and full it might be for the respondent. So I don't think there is a consistent way of asking that, especially that has been established for low-income countries. What is being done in developed countries are various methods. One of them is to ask a range. So, instead of asking only a point estimate, what's the chance you will have a job, you would say what is the lower probability and what is the higher probability. If you're asking about the binary event, what you're really after is how likely it is that this probability is above 0.5, is above 0.7. Again, you can visually represent this, but they are quite challenging in my opinion. You can also, I think the range is a good option. And you can, think about them as representing ambiguity or representing a confidence interval around a distribution of underlying belief.
Thank you. Before going to the next question, I have one more, and I think that might be relevant to quite a lot of the audience as well. A lot of the techniques right now that we've spoken about are relatively complex and rely to a large extent on visual aids. Now, in times of COVID, we, as researchers, often have to rely on phone surveys where visual aids are not very practical. So I wanted to ask both of you, maybe starting with Mungai, do you have any advice to researchers who want to measure beliefs over the phone? What are best practices? What are your experiences in doing that?
That's Lukas. So this is a difficult one, especially for the developing countries in context in which we've worked in or which we're currently working in. So I can imagine, so if it boils down to the literacy of your respondents, because we know, for instance, there have been cases where researchers have used more advanced technologies such as the slide bar, and these have been sent over the internet. So that can be achieved, but actually in an actual phone interview, I can imagine how difficult it can be to ask, especially for developing ones. In other parts of the world, perhaps you can just ask these questions directly when you're asking about the chances. But I'm not really sure there's any way to do over the phone the beliefs, because these people need to see it visually. So perhaps Adeline can add on anything on that.
Yeah, I think that's a very important one and a tricky one as well. So we have been in the field in Malawi in June, July, asking this belief question, and we were debating, and we had to do it over the phone, obviously, and we were debating how we were going to do that. Eventually, after toying with different options, we just ask respondents to remember. So it's a little bit different because it's a panel and they've done the belief question in the past. We ask them to remember the beans question and tell us the number of beans out of 10. The distribution we get over the phone are very similar to the one we get in the field, but the sample has been used to the format. I haven't tried into a new sample. We've been thinking about this and trying maybe to just, there's various options. One, it depends how much time and effort you want to spend for this belief question. One could be to ask the respondents to actually go and pick 10 stones or 10, mice, corn, we were talking, and ask them to use this visual format while they're on the phone. But that could be quite time consuming. The other option is just to ask them the chances out of 10 with lots of explanation and practice questions. But this is to be trialed, I think, and I would be very glad to hear other experiences on that.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's already very useful. I realize we are out of time, so again, thank you very much to both of you for giving us such great insights today. I certainly took something away from it, and I hope our audience did as well. Also, thank you to all the participants who asked questions. I realize there's still unanswered questions. As I said previously, we'll try to get to them by email. Before to close up, just a quick reminder Next week, we have the next seminar in this series, this time on the question of how to measure like answers to like sensitive topics such as domestic violence or other topics. And we have some experts again who've used these methods extensively in the field and have a lot to say about this. Note the different time, it's 12 p.m. BST, because all speakers are based in like similar time zones. Yeah, and to wrap up, after today, we'll send out a quick survey with feedback on the session. So we are really keen to hear feedback on how this went, whether you found it useful and what we can improve for the next sessions. This is the second time we do it, and we've already learned some things from the first round of feedback, but like, it's work in progress, and we'd very much like to hear from you. Yeah, so thank you very much. We'll post a recording of this seminar online, so you're very welcome to share this with your contacts and use it as a reference in the future. Thank you for attending.